The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress is a four-engine heavy bomber aircraft developed in the 1930s for the United States Army Air Corps. Competing against Douglas and Martin for a contract to build 200 bombers, the Boeing entry outperformed both competitors and exceeded the Air Corps expectations. Although Boeing lost the contract because the prototype crashed, the Air Corps was so impressed with Boeing's design that they ordered 13 more B-17s for further evaluation. From its introduction in 1938, the B-17 Flying Fortress evolved through numerous design advances. The B-17 was primarily employed by the United States Army Air Forces in the daylight precision strategic bombing campaign of World War II against German industrial and military targets. The United States 8th Air Force, based at many airfields in southern England, and the 15th Air Force, based in Italy, complemented the RAF Bomber Command's nighttime area bombing in the combined bomber offensive to help secure air superiority over the cities, factories and battlefields of Western Europe in preparation for the invasion of France in 1944. The B-17 also participated to a lesser extent in the war in the Pacific, early in World War II, where it conducted raids against Japanese shipping and airfields. From its pre-war inception, the USAAC touted the aircraft as a strategic weapon. It was a potent, high-flying, long-range bomber that was able to defend itself, and to return home despite extensive battle damage. Its reputation quickly took on mythic proportions, and widely circulated stories and photos of notable numbers and examples of B-17's surviving battle damage increased its iconic status. With a service ceiling greater than any of its Allied contemporaries, the B-17 established itself as an effective weapons system, dropping more bombs than any other U.S. aircraft in World War II. Of the 1.5 million metric tons of bombs dropped on Germany and its occupied territories by U.S. aircraft, 640,000 tons were dropped from B-17s. As of September 2011, 13 aircraft remain airworthy, with dozens more in storage or on static display. Development, origins. On August 8, 1934, the U.S. Army Air Corps tendered a proposal for a multi-engine bomber to replace the Martin B-10. The Air Corps was looking for a bomber capable of reinforcing the air forces in Hawaii, Panama, and Alaska. Requirements were that it would carry a useful bomb load at an altitude of 10,000 feet for 10 hours with a top speed of at least 200 miles per hour. They also desired, but did not require, a range of 2,000 miles and a speed of 250 miles per hour. The competition for the Air Corps contract would be decided by a fly-off between Boeing's design, the Douglas DB-1, and the Martin Model 146 at Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio. The prototype B-17, designated Model 299, was designed by a team of engineers led by E. Gifford Emery and Edward Curtis Wells, and was built at Boeing's own expense. It combined features of the experimental Boeing XB-15 bomber with the Boeing 247 transport aircraft. The B-17's armament consisted of up to 4,800 pounds of bombs on two racks in the bomb bay behind the cockpit, and initially possessed 5 0.30 inches machine guns. It was powered by four Pratt & Whitney A1690 Hornet radial engines, each producing 750 horsepower at 7,000 feet. The first flight of the Model 299 was on July 28, 1935 with Boeing Chief Test Pilot Leslie Tower at the controls. Richard Williams, a reporter for the Seattle Times, coined the name Flying Fortress when the Model 299 was rolled out bristling with multiple machine gun installations. The most unusual gun emplacement was the nose installation, which allowed the single machine gun to be fired toward almost any frontal angle that an approaching enemy fighter would take to attack the B-17. Boeing was quick to see the value of the name and had it trademarked for use. Boeing also claimed in some of the early press releases that Model 299 was the first combat aircraft that could continue its mission if one of its four engines failed. On August 20, 1935, the prototype flew from Seattle to Wright Field in 9 hours and 3 minutes at an average cruising speed of 252 miles per hour, much faster than the competition. At the fly-off, the four-engine Boeing's performance was superior to those of the twin-engine DB-1 in Model 146. Then Major General Frank Maxwell Andrews of the GHQ Air Force believed that the long-range capabilities of four-engine large aircraft were more effective than shorter-ranged, twin-engined aircraft, and that the B-17 was better suited to their doctrine. His opinions were shared by the Air Corps procurement officers, and even before the competition had finished they suggested buying 65 B-17s. Development continued on the Boeing Model 299, and on October 30, 1935, Army Air Corps test pilot Major Ployer Peter Hill and Boeing employee Les Tower took the Model 299 on a second evaluation flight. The crew forgot to disengage the gust locks, a system of devices integral to the design that held the bomber's movable control surfaces in place while the aircraft was parked on the ground. After takeoff, due to the failure to manually disengage all of the gust locks, the aircraft entered a steep climb, stalled, nosed over, and crashed, killing Hill and Tower. The crashed Model 299 could not finish the evaluation and, while the Air Corps was still enthusiastic about the aircraft's potential, Army officials were daunted by the much greater expense per aircraft, and as the competition could not be completed Boeing was legally disqualified from the consideration for the contract. Army Chief of Staff Malin Craig cancelled the order for 65 YB-17s, and ordered 133 of the twin-engine Douglas B-18 Bolo instead. The loss was not total, but Boeing's hopes for a substantial bomber contract were dashed. Initial orders, regardless, the USAAC had been impressed by the prototype's performance, and on January 17, 1936, through a legal loophole, the Air Corps ordered 13 YB-17s for service testing. The YB-17 incorporated a number of significant changes from the Model 299, including more powerful Wright R1820-39 Cyclone engines replacing the original Pratt & Whitneys. Although the prototype was company-owned and never received a military serial, the term XB-17 was retroactively applied to the airframe and has entered the lexicon to describe the first Flying Fortress. Between March 1 and August 4, 1937, 12 of the 13 Y-1B-17s were delivered to the 2nd Bombardment Group at Langley Field in Virginia for operational development and flight tests. One suggestion adopted was the use of a pre-flight checklist to avoid accidents such as that which befell the Model 299. In one of their first missions, 3 B-17s, directed by lead navigator Lieutenant Curtis LeMay, were sent by General Andrews to intercept and photograph the Italian ocean liner Rex 610 miles off the Atlantic coast. The mission was successful and widely publicized. The 13th Y-1B-17 was delivered to the Material Division at Wright Field, Ohio, to be used for flight testing. A 14th Y-1B-17, originally constructed for ground testing of the airframe's strength, was upgraded and fitted with exhaust-driven turbochargers. Scheduled to fly in 1937, it encountered problems with the turbochargers, and its first flight was delayed until April 29, 1938. The aircraft was delivered to the Army on January 31, 1939. Once service testing was complete, the Y-1B-17s and Y-1B-17A were redesignated B-17 and B-17A respectively to signify the change to operational status. Opposition to the Air Corps' ambitions for the acquisition of more B-17s faded, and in late 1937, 10 more aircraft designated B-17B were ordered to equip 2 bombardment groups, one on each U.S. coast. Improved with larger flaps, rudder and a well-framed Plexigler's nose, the B-17Bs were delivered in 5 small batches between July 1939 and March 1940. In July 1940, a significant order for 512 B-17s was issued. However, prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor, fewer than 200 B-17s were in service with the Army. A total of 155 B-17s of all variants were delivered between 11 January 1937 and 30 November 1941, but production quickly accelerated with the B-17 eventually setting the record for achieving the highest production rate for large aircraft. The aircraft went on to serve in every World War II combat zone, and by the time production ended in May 1945, 12,731 aircraft had been built by Boeing, Douglas, and Vega. Though the crash of the prototype 299 in 1935 had almost wiped out Boeing, now it was seen as a boon. Instead of building models based on experimental engineering, Boeing had been hard at work developing their bomber and now had versions ready for production far better than would have been possible otherwise. One of the most significant weapons of World War II would be ready, but only by a hair. Design and variants. The aircraft went through several alterations in each of its design stages and variants. Of the 13 B-17s ordered for service testing, 12 were used by the 2nd Bomb Group of Langley Field, Virginia, to develop heavy bombing techniques, and the 13th was used for flight testing at the Material Division at Wright Field, Ohio. Experiments on this aircraft led to the use of a quartet of turbo-superchargers which would become standard on the B-17 line. A 14th aircraft, the B-17A, originally destined for ground testing only and upgraded with the turbochargers, was redesignated B-17A after testing had finished. As the production line developed, Boeing engineers continued to improve upon the basic design. To enhance performance at slower speeds, the B-17B was altered to include larger rudder and flaps. The B-17C changed from 3 bulged, oval-shaped machine gun blisters to 2 flush, oval-shaped machine gun window openings and a single bathtub machine gun housing on the lower fuselage, that resembled the similarly configured and located ventral defensive emplacement on the German Heinkel He-111P series medium bomber. Models A through D of the B-17 were designed defensively, while the large-tailed B-17E was the first model primarily focused on offensive warfare. The B-17E was an extensive revision of the Model 299 design. The fuselage was extended by 10 ft. A much larger rear fuselage, vertical tail fin, rudder, and horizontal stabilizer were added to the design. A gunner's position was added in the new tail. The nose remained relatively the same as the earlier B through D versions had, but with the addition of a Sperry electrically powered manned dorsal gun turret just behind the cockpit, and the similarly powered manned ventral ball turret just aft of the bomb bay, replacing a relatively hard-to-use, Bendix-designed remotely operated ventral turret on the earliest examples of the E variant, that had also been used on the earlier marks of the North American B-25 Mitchell, resulted in a 20% increase in aircraft weight. The B-17's turbocharged Wright R-1820 Cyclone 9 engines were upgraded to increasingly more powerful versions of the same powerplants multiple times throughout its production, and similarly, the number of machine gun emplacement locations were increased to enhance their aircraft's combat effectiveness. The B-17F variants were the primary versions flying for the 8th Air Force to face the Germans in 1943, and had standardized the manned Sperry ball turret for ventral defense, along with an enlarged, nearly frameless Plexiglas bombardier's nose enclosure for much improved forward vision. 2 experimental versions of the B-17 were flown under different designations, the XB-38 Flying Fortress and the YB-40 Flying Fortress. The XB-38 was an engine test bed for Allison V-17-10 liquid-cooled engines, should the Wright engines normally used on the B-17 become unavailable. The only prototype XB-38 to fly crashed on its 9th flight and the type was abandoned, the V-17-10 being kept for fighters. The YB-40 was a heavily armed modification of the standard B-17 used before the P-51 Mustang, an effective long-range fighter, became available to act as escort. Additional armament included an additional dorsal turret in the radio room, a remotely operated and fired Bendix-built chain turret, and twin .50 guns in each of the waist positions. The ammunition load was over 11,000 rounds, making the YB-40 well over 10,000 lb heavier than a fully loaded B-17F. The YB-40s with their numerous heavy modifications had trouble keeping up with the lighter bombers once they had dropped their bombs, and so the project was abandoned and finally phased out in July 1943, but not before the final production blocks of the B-17F from Douglas plants adopted the YB-40's remotely operated and fired Bendix chain turret for a much improved forward defensive weapons installation. By the time the definitive B-17G appeared, The number of guns had been increased from 7 to 13, the designs of the gun stations were finalized, and other adjustments were completed. The B-17G was the final version of the Flying Fortress, incorporating all changes made to its predecessor, the B-17F, adopting the remotely operated chin turret for forward defense from the YB-40 gunship version, and in total 8,680 were built, the last one on July 28, 1945. Many B-17GS were converted for other missions such as cargo hauling, engine testing and reconnaissance. Initially designated SB-17G, a number of B-17GS were also converted for search and rescue duties, later to be redesignated B-17 hours. Late in World War II, at least 25 B-17s were fitted with radio controls and television cameras, loaded with 20,000 lb of high explosives and dubbed BQ-7 Aphrodite missiles for Operation Aphrodite. The operation, which involved remotely flying Aphrodite drones onto their targets by accompanying CQ-17 mothership control aircraft, was approved on June 26, 1944, and assigned to the 388th Bombardment Group stationed at RAF Ersfield, a satellite of RAF Nittischel. The first 4 drones were sent to Mimoyex, the Sarakat V-1 bunker, Watkin and Wise Aarons on August 4, causing little damage. The project came to a sudden end with the unexplained mid-air explosion over the Blythe estuary of the B-24, part of the United States Navy's contribution as Project Anvil, en route for Heligoland piloted by Lieutenant Joseph P. Kennedy, Jr., future U.S. President John F. Kennedy's elder brother. Blast damage was caused over a radius of 5 miles. British authorities were anxious that no similar accidents should again occur, and the Aphrodite project was scrapped in early 1945. Operational history: the B-17 began operations in World War II with the RAF in 1941, and in the Southwest Pacific with the U.S. Army. The 19th Bombardment Group had deployed to Clark Field in the Philippines a few weeks before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor as the first of a planned heavy bomber buildup in the Pacific. Half of the group's B-17s were wiped out on December 8, 1941 when they were caught on the ground during refueling and rearming for a planned attack on Japanese airfields on Formosa. The small force of B-17s operated against the Japanese invasion force until they were withdrawn to Darwin, in Australia's Northern Territory. In early 1942, the 7th Bombardment Group began arriving in Java with a mixed force of B-17s and LB-30 per B-24s. After the defeat in Java, the 19th withdrew to Australia where it continued in combat until it was sent back home by General George C. Kenney when he arrived in Australia in mid-1942. In July 1942, the first USAAF B-17s were sent to England to join 8th Air Force. Later that year 2 groups moved to Algeria to join 12th Air Force for operations in North Africa. The B-17s were primarily involved in the daylight precision strategic bombing campaign against German targets ranging from U-boat pens, docks, warehouses and airfields to industrial targets such as aircraft factories. In the campaign against German aircraft forces in preparation for the invasion of France, B-17 and B-24 raids were directed against German aircraft production while their presence drew the Luftwaffe fighters into battle with Allied fighters. Early models proved to be unsuitable for combat use over Europe and it was the B-17E that was first successfully used by the USAAF. The defense expected from bombers operating in close formation alone did not prove effective and the bombers needed fighter escorts to operate successfully. During World War II, the B-17 equipped 32 overseas combat groups, inventory peaking in August 1944 at 4,574 USAAF aircraft worldwide. B-17s dropped 640,036 short tons of bombs on European targets dropped by the Liberator and 463,544 short tons dropped by all other U.S. aircraft. The British heavy bombers, the Avro Lancaster and Handley Page Halifax, dropped 608,612 long tons and 224,207 long tons respectively. The RAF. The Royal Air Force entered World War II with no heavy bomber of its own in service. The biggest available were long-range medium bombers such as the Vickers Wellington, which could carry up to 4,500 pounds of bombs. While the short Stirling and Handley Page Halifax would become its primary bombers by 1941, in early 1940 the RAF entered into an agreement with the U.S. Army Air Corps to be provided with 20 B-17Cs, which were given the service name Fortress I. Their first operation, against Wilhelmshaven on July 8, 1941 was unsuccessful. On July 24, the target was Brest, France, but again the bombers missed completely. By September, after the RAF had lost 8 B-17Cs in combat or to accidents and many instances of aborts due to mechanical problems, Bomber Command abandoned daylight bombing raids because of the Fortress I's poor performance. The experience showed both the RAF and USAAF that the B-17C was not ready for combat, and that improved defenses, larger bomb loads and more accurate bombing methods were required. However, the USAAF continued using the B-17 as a day bomber, despite misgivings by the RAF that attempts at daylight bombing would be ineffective. As usage by Bomber Command had been curtailed, the RAF transferred its remaining Fortress I aircraft to Coastal Command for use as a long-range maritime patrol aircraft instead. These were later augmented in August 1942 by 19 Fortress Mk2 and 45 Fortress Mkiia. A Fortress from No. 206 Squadron RAF sank U-627 on October 27, 1942, the first of 11 new boat kills credited to RAF Fortress bombers during the war. The RAF's No. 223 Squadron, as part of 100 Group, operated a number of fortresses equipped with an electronic warfare system known as Airborne Cigar. This was operated by Germani Euro-speaking radio operators who would identify and jam German ground controllers' broadcasts to their night fighters. They could also pose as ground controllers themselves with the intention of steering night fighters away from the bomber streams. Initial USAAF operations over Europe, the Air Corps on June 20, 1941, using the B-17 and other bombers, bombed from high altitudes using the then-secret Norden bomb sight, known as the Blue Ox, which was an optical electromechanical gyro-stabilized analog computer. The device was able to determine, from variables input by the bombardier, the point at which the aircraft's bombs should be released to hit the target. The bombardier essentially took over flight control of the aircraft during the bomb run, maintaining a level altitude during the final moments before release. The USAAF began building up its air forces in Europe using B-17s soon after entering the war. The first 8th Air Force units arrived in High Wycombe, England, on May 12, 1942, to form the 97th Bomb Group. On August 17, 1942, 12 B-17s of the 97th, with the lead aircraft piloted by Major Paul Tibbets and carrying Brigadier General Ira Eaker as an observer, were escorted by 4 squadrons of RAF Spitfires on the first USAAF heavy bomber raid over Europe, against railroad marshalling yards at Rouen-Sotteville in France, while a further 6 aircraft flew a diversionary raid along the French coast. The operation was a success, with only minor damage to 2 aircraft and half the bombs landing in the target area. The raid helped assuage British doubts about the capabilities of American heavy bombers in operations over Europe. As the raids of the American bombing campaign grew in numbers and frequency, German interception efforts grew in strength, such that unescorted bombing missions came to be discouraged. Combined offensive, the 2 different strategies of the American and British bomber commands were organized at the Casablanca Conference in January 1943. The resulting combined bomber offensive would weaken the Wehrmacht, destroy German morale and establish air superiority through Operation Point Blank's destruction of German fighter strength in preparation of a ground offensive. The USAAF bombers would attack by day, with British operations chiefly against industrial cities by night. Operation Point Blank opened with attacks on targets in Western Europe. General Ira Eaker and the 8th Air Force placed highest priority on attacks on the German aircraft industry, especially fighter assembly plants, engine factories and ball bearing manufacturers. Attacks began in April 1943 on heavily fortified key industrial plants in Bremen and Recklinghausen. Since the airfield bombings were not appreciably reducing German fighter strength, additional B-17 groups were formed, and Eker ordered major missions deeper into Germany against important industrial targets. The 8th Air Force then targeted the ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt, hoping to cripple the war effort there. The first raid on August 17, 1943 did not result in critical damage to the factories, with the 230 attacking B-17s being intercepted by an estimated 300 Luftwaffe fighters. The Germans shot down 36 aircraft with a loss of 200 men, and coupled with a raid earlier in the day against Regensburg, a total of 60 B-17s were lost that day. A second attempt on Schweinfurt on October 14, 1943 would later come to be known as Black Thursday. While the attack was successful at disrupting the entire works, severely curtailing work there for the remainder of the war, it was at an extreme cost. Of the 291 attacking fortresses, 60 were shot down over Germany, 5 crashed on approach to Britain, and 12 more were scrapped due to damage, a total loss of 77 B-17s. A total of 122 bombers were damaged and needed repairs before their next flight. Out of 2,900 men in the crews, about 650 men did not return, although some survived as prisoners of war. Only 33 bombers landed without damage. These losses were a result of concentrated attacks by over 300 German fighters. Such high losses of air crews could not be sustained, and the USAAF, recognizing the vulnerability of heavy bombers to interceptors when operating alone, suspended daylight bomber raids deep into Germany until the development of an escort fighter that could protect the bombers all the way from the United Kingdom to Germany and back. At the same time, the German night fighting ability noticeably improved to counter the nighttime strikes, challenging the conventional faith in the cover of darkness. The 8th Air Force alone lost 176 bombers in October 1943, and was to suffer similar casualties on January 11, 1944 on missions to Eschurschleben, Halberstadt and Brunswick. Lieutenant General James Doolittle, commander of the 8th, had ordered the 2nd Schweinfurt mission to be cancelled as the weather deteriorated, but the lead units had already entered hostile airspace and continued with the mission. Most of the escorts turned back or missed the rendezvous, and as a result 60 B-17s were destroyed. A third raid on Schweinfurt on February 24, 1944 highlighted what came to be known as Big Week, during which the bombing missions were directed against German aircraft production. German fighters would have to respond, and the North American P-51 Mustang and Republic P-47 Thunderbolt fighters accompanying the American heavies all the way to and from the targets would engage them. The escort fighters reduced the loss rate to below 7%, with only 247 B-17s lost and 3,500 sorties while taking part in the Big Week raids. By September 1944, 27 of the 40 bombed groups of the 8th Air Force and 6 of the 21 groups of the 15th Air Force used B-17s. Losses to flak continued to take a high toll of heavy bombers through 1944, but by April 27, 1945, the rate of aircraft loss was so low that replacement aircraft were no longer arriving and the number of bombers per bomb group was reduced. The combined bomber offensive was effectively complete. Pacific Theater. On December 7, 1941, a group of 12 B-17s of the 38th and 88th Reconnaissance Squadrons, en route to reinforce the Philippines, were flown into Pearl Harbor from Hamilton Field, California, arriving during the attack on Pearl Harbor. Leonard "Smitty" Smith Humiston, co-pilot on First Lieutenant Robert H. Richards B-17C, AAF SN 40-2049, reported that he thought the U.S. Navy was giving the flight a 21-gun salute to celebrate the arrival of the bombers, after which he realized that Pearl Harbor was under attack. The fortress came under fire from Japanese fighter aircraft, though the crew was unharmed with the exception of one member who suffered an abrasion on his hand. Enemy activity forced an abort from Hickam Field to Bellows Field, where the aircraft overran the runway and into a ditch where it was then strafed. Although initially deemed repairable, 40-2049 received more than 200 bullet holes and never flew again. 10 of the 12 fortresses survived the attack. By 1941, the Far East Air Force based at Clark Field in the Philippines had 35 B-17s, with the War Department eventually planning to raise that to 165. When the FEAF received word of the attack on Pearl Harbor, General Lewis H. Brereton sent his bombers and fighters on various patrol missions to prevent them from being caught on the ground. Brereton planned B-17 raids on Japanese airfields in Formosa, in accordance with Rainbow 5 war plan directives, but this was overruled by General Douglas MacArthur. A series of disputed discussions and decisions, followed by several confusing and false reports of air attacks, delayed the authorization of the sortie. By the time the B-17s and escorting Curtiss P-40 Warhawk fighters were about to get airborne, they were destroyed by Japanese bombers of the 11th Air Fleet. The FEAF lost half its aircraft during the first strike, and was all but destroyed over the next few days. Another early World War II Pacific engagement on December 10, 1941 involved Colin Kelly, who reportedly crashed his B-17 into the Japanese battleship Haruna, which was later acknowledged as a near-bomb miss on the heavy cruiser Ashigara. Nonetheless, this deed made him a celebrated war hero. Kelly's B-17 CAAF-SN 40-2045 crashed about 6 mi from Clark Field after he held the burning fortress steady long enough for the surviving crew to bail out. Kelly was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. Noted Japanese Asaburo Sakai is credited with this kill, and in the process, came to respect the ability of the fortress to absorb punishment. B-17s were used in early battles of the Pacific with little success, notably the Battle of Coral Sea and Battle of Midway. While there, the 5th Air Force B-17s were tasked with disrupting the Japanese sea lanes. Air Corps doctrine dictated bombing runs from high altitude, but it was soon discovered that only 1% of their bombs hit targets. However, B-17s were operating at heights too great for most A-6M0 fighters to reach, and the B-17's heavy gun armament was more than a match for lightly protected Japanese aircraft. On March 2, 1943, 6 B-17s of the 64th Squadron attacked a major Japanese troop convoy from 10,000 EFT during the early stages of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, off New Guinea, using skip bombing to sink 3 merchant ships including the Kyokusei Maru. A B-17 was shot down by a New Britain-based A-6M0, whose pilot then machine-gunned some of the B-17 crew members as they descended in parachutes and attacked others in the water after they landed. Later, 13 B-17s bombed the convoy from medium altitude, causing the ships to disperse and prolonging the journey. The convoy was subsequently all but destroyed by a combination of low-level strafing runs by Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters, and skip bombing by USAAF North American B-25 Mitchells at 100 EFT, while B-17s claimed 5 hits from higher altitudes. A peak of 168 B-17 bombers were in the Pacific Theater in September 1942, with all groups converting to other types by mid-1943. In mid-1942, General Arnold decided that the B-17 was inadequate for the kind of operations required in the Pacific and made plans to replace all of the B-17s in the theater with B-24s as soon as they became available. Although the conversion was not complete until mid-1943, B-17 combat operations in the Pacific Theater came to an end after a little over a year. Surviving aircraft were reassigned to the 54th Troop Carrier Wing Special Airdrop Section, and were used to drop supplies to ground forces operating in close contact with the enemy. Special Airdrop B-17 supported Australian commandos operating near the Japanese stronghold at Rabaul, which had been the primary B-17 target in 1942 and early 1943. Bomber defense. Before the advent of long-range fighter escorts, B-17s had only their .50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns to rely on for defense during the bombing runs over Europe. As the war intensified, Boeing used feedback from air crews to improve each new variant with increased armament and armor. The number of defensive guns increased from 40.50 in machine guns and 10.30 in nose machine gun in the B-17C, to 13.50 in machine guns in the B-17G. But because the bombers could not maneuver when attacked by fighters, and during their final bomb run they needed to be flown straight and level. Individual aircraft struggled to fend off a direct attack. A 1943 survey by the Air Corps found that over half the bombers shot down by the Germans had left the protection of the main formation. To address this problem, the United States developed the bomb group formation, which evolved into the staggered combat box formation where all the B-17s could safely cover any others in their formation with their machine guns, making a formation of the bombers a dangerous target to engage by enemy fighters. Luftwaffe fighter pilots likened attacking a B-17 combat box formation to encountering a flygendes Stachelschwein, flying porcupine, with dozens of machine guns on a combat box formation of bombers, aimed at them from almost every direction. However, the use of this rigid formation meant that individual aircraft could not engage in evasive maneuvers, they had to fly constantly in a straight line, which made them vulnerable to the German flak. Moreover, German fighter aircraft later used the tactic of high-speed strafing passes rather than engaging with individual aircraft to inflict damage with minimum risk. As a result, the B-17's loss rate was up to 25% on some early missions, and it was not until the advent of long-range fighter escorts resulting in the degradation of the Luftwaffe as an effective interceptor force between February and June 1944, that the B-17 became strategically potent. The B-17 was noted for its ability to absorb battle damage, still reach its target and bring its crew home safely. Wally Hoffman, a B-17 pilot with the 8th Air Force during World War II, said, "The plane can be cut and slashed almost to pieces by enemy fire and bring its crew home." Martin Caidin reported one instance in which a B-17 suffered a mid-air collision with a Focke-Wulf FW-190, losing an engine and suffering serious damage to both the starboard horizontal stabilizer and the vertical stabilizer, and being knocked out of formation by the impact. The B-17 was reported as shot down by observers, but it survived and brought its crew home without injury. Its toughness was compensation for its shorter range and lighter bomb load compared to the B-24 and British Avro Lancaster heavy bombers. Stories abound of B-17s returning to base with tails having been destroyed, with only a single engine functioning or even with large portions of wings having been damaged by flak. This durability, together with the large operational numbers in the 8th Air Force and the fame achieved by the Memphis Belle, made the B-17 a key bomber aircraft of the war. Other factors such as combat effectiveness and political issues also contributed to the B-17's success. The B-17 design went through 8 major changes over the course of its production, culminating in the B-17G, differing from its immediate predecessor by the addition of a bombardier-operated, remotely controlled chin turret with 2.50 in caliber M2 Browning machine guns under the nose, also fitted to the final 86 production aircraft of the B-17 FDLs built by Douglas, after being first tried in May 1943 as part of the increased armament system of the YB-40. This eliminated the B-17's main defensive weakness in head-on attacks. The Luftwaffe. After examining wrecked B-17s and B-24s, Luftwaffe officers discovered that on average it took around 20 hits with 20 mm shells fired from the rear to bring them down. Pilots of average ability hit the bombers with only about 2% of the rounds they fired, so to obtain 20 hits, the average pilot had to fire 1,020 on rounds at a bomber. Early versions of the FW-190, one of the best German interceptor fighters, were equipped with 220 MGFF cannons, which carried only 500 rounds when belt-fed, and later with the better Mauser MG-151/20 cannons, which had a longer effective range than the MGFF weapon. Later versions carried 4 or even 6 MG-151/20 cannon and twin 13mm machine guns. The German fighters found that when attacking from the front, where fewer defensive guns were mounted, it took only 4 or 5 hits to bring a bomber down. To address the FW-190's shortcomings, the number of cannons fitted was doubled to 4 with a corresponding increase in the amount of ammunition carried, creating the Sternbock bomber-destroyer version. This type replaced the vulnerable twin-engine Zesta paragraph rare heavy fighters which could not survive interception by P-51 Mustangs flying well ahead of the combat boxes in an air supremacy role starting very early in 1944. to clear any Luftwaffe defensive fighters from the skies. By 1944, a further upgrade to Rheinmetall Borsig's 30 Mk108 cannons mounted either in the wing, or in underwing, conformal mount gun pods, was made for the Sturmbock Focke-Wulfs as either the /R2 or /R8 field modification kits, enabling aircraft to bring a bomber down with just a few hits. The adoption of the 21 cm Nbelwaffe-derived Werfer Granit 21 rocket mortar by the Luftwaffe in mid-August 1943 promised the introduction of a major standoff style of offensive weapon. A Euro-1 strut-mounted tubular launcher was fixed under each wing panel on the Luftwaffe's single-engine fighters, and two under each wing panel of a few twin-engine Bf-110 Daylights Lister paragraph rare aircraft. However, due to the slow 715 mph velocity and characteristic ballistic drop of the fired rocket, and the small number of fighters fitted with the weapons, the WFR GA-21 never had a major effect on the combat box formations of fortresses. The Luftwaffe also fitted heavy-caliber Bohr-Canon Series 37, 50 and even 75 cannon as anti-bomber weapons on twin-engined aircraft such as the special Ju-88P fighters, as well as one model of the Me-410 Hornets, but these measures did not have much effect on the American strategic bomber offensive. The Me-262, however, had moderate success against the B-17 late in the war. With its usual nose-mounted armament of 4 Mk108 cannons, and with some examples later equipped with the R-4M rocket, launched from underwing racks, it could fire from outside the range of the bomber's .50 and defensive guns and bring an aircraft down with one hit, as both the Mk108's shells and the R-4M's warheads were filled with a shattering force of the strongly brisant hexagon military explosive. Luftwaffe captured B-17s, during World War II, after crash landing or being forced down. Approximately 40 B-17s were captured and refurbished, with about a dozen put back into the air. Given German Borkenkreuz national markings on their wings and fuselage sides, and Hakenkreuz swastika tailfin flashes, the captured B-17s were used to determine the B-17's vulnerabilities and to train German interceptor pilots in attack tactics. Others, with the cover designations Dornier Do-200 and Do-288, were used as long-range transports by the Kampfgeschwader 200 Special Duties Unit, carrying out agent drops and supplying secret airstrips in the Middle East and North Africa. They were chosen specifically for these missions as being more suitable for this role than other available German aircraft. They never attempted to deceive the Allies and always wore full Luftwaffe markings. One B-17 of KG-200, bearing the Luftwaffe's KG-200 Geschwaderknung markings A3 plus FB, was interned by Spain when it landed at Valencia Airfield, June 27, 1944, remaining there for the rest of the war. It has been alleged that some B-17s kept their Allied markings and were used by the Luftwaffe in attempts to infiltrate B-17 bombing formations and report on their positions and altitudes. According to these allegations, the practice was initially successful, but Army Air Force combat air crews quickly developed and established standard procedures to first warn off, and then fire upon any stranger trying to join a group's formation. Soviet-interned B-17s, the U.S. did not offer B-17s to the Soviet Union as part of its War Materiel Assistance Program, but at least 73 aircraft were acquired by the Soviet Air Force. These were aircraft that landed with mechanical trouble during the shuttle bombing raids over Germany or that had been damaged by a Luftwaffe raid in Poltava. The Soviets restored 23 to flying condition and concentrated them in the 890th Bomber Regiment of the 45th Bomber Division, but they never saw combat. In 1946 the regiment was assigned to the Kazan factory to aid in the Soviet effort to reproduce the more advanced Boeing B-29 as the Tupolev To-4. Swiss-interned B-17s, during the war, the Allied bomber offensive sometimes took U.S. or British bombers into Swiss airspace, either damaged craft seeking safe haven or even on occasions bombing Swiss cities by accident. Swiss aircraft would attempt to intercept and force individual aircraft to land, interning their crews. One Swiss pilot was killed, shot down by a U.S. bomber crew in September 1944. From then on, Red and white neutrality bands were added to the wings of Swiss aircraft to stop accidental attacks by Allied aircraft. Official Swiss records identify 6,501 airspace violations during the course of the war, with 198 foreign aircraft landing on Swiss territory and 56 aircraft crashing there. One prime example, in October 1943 the Swiss interned Boeing B-17 F-25VE, tail number 25841, and her U.S. flight crew after the Flying Fortress developed engine trouble and was forced to land following its bombing raid over Germany. The aircraft was then turned over to the Swiss Air Force, who then flew the bomber until the end of the war, using other interned but non-flyable B-17s for spare parts. The bomber was repainted a dark olive drab, but retained its light grey painted undersurfaces. It carried Swiss National White Cross insignia in red squares on both sides of its rudder, fuselage sides, and the underside wings, with white crosses in red roundels atop both upper wings. As on its grey undersurfaces, the B-17F also carried light grey flash letters RD, and I on either side of fuselage's Swiss national insignia. Japanese captured B-17s. 3 damaged B-17s, 1 D model and 2 E models, were rebuilt to flying status by Japanese technicians and mechanics. The parts used were stripped from captured B-17 wrecks in both the Philippines and the Netherlands East Indies. The 3 bombers, containing captured top-secret Norden bomb sites, were then flown to Japan where they underwent extensive technical evaluation by the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force's Air Technical Research Laboratory. The D model was later deemed an obsolete design and the 2 E models were used to develop B-17 air combat counter-tactics. They were also used as enemy aircraft in several Japanese propaganda films. No traces of these captured flying fortresses were found in Japan by Allied occupation forces following the war. They were assumed scrapped late in the war for their vital war materials. Post-war history, U.S. Air Force. Following the end of World War II, the B-17 was quickly phased out of use as a bomber and the Army Air Forces retired most of its fleet. Flight crews ferried the bombers back across the Atlantic to the United States where the majority were sold for scrap and melted down, although significant numbers remained in use in second-line roles such as VIP transports, air-sea rescue and photo reconnaissance. Strategic Air Command, established in 1946, used reconnaissance B-17s until 1949. With the disestablishment of the U.S. Army Air Forces and the establishment of an independent U.S. Air Force in 1947, most extant B-17s were transferred to USAAF. The USAAF Air Rescue Service of the Military Air Transport Service operated B-17s as so-called Dumbo Air Sea Rescue aircraft. Work on using B-17s to carry airborne lifeboats had begun in 1943, but they entered service in the European theatre only in February 1945, also being used to provide search and rescue support for B-29 raids against Japan. About 130 B-17s were converted to the air-sea rescue role, at first designated B-17 hours and later SB-17G. Some SB-17s had their defensive guns removed, while others retained their guns to allow use close to combat areas. The SB-17 served through the Korean War, remaining in service with USAF until the mid-1950s. See also, 3205th Drone Group. In 1946, surplus B-17s were chosen as drone aircraft for atmospheric sampling during the Operation Crossroads atomic bomb tests, being able to fly close to or even through the mushroom clouds without endangering a crew. This led to more widespread conversion of B-17s as drones and drone control aircraft, both for further use in atomic testing and as targets for testing surface-to-air and air-to-air missiles. 107 B-17s were converted to drones. The last operational mission flown by a USAF Fortress was conducted on August 6, 1959, when DB-17P, AF's Number 44 to 83684 directed a QB-17G, AF's Number 44 to 83717, out of Holloman Air Force Base, New Mexico, as a target for an AIM-4 Falcon air-to-air missile fired from an McDonnell F-101 Voodoo. A retirement ceremony was held several days later at Holloman AFB, after which 44 to 83,684 was retired to the Military Aircraft Storage and Disposition Center at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, Arizona. Perhaps the most famous B-17, the Memphis Belle, is currently being fastidiously restored simultaneously with the B-17D the Swooser to its World War II wartime appearance by the National Museum of the United States Air Force at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Ohio. U.S. Navy and U.S. Coast Guard. During the last year of World War II and shortly thereafter, the United States Navy acquired 48 ex-USAAF B-17s for patrol and air-sea rescue work. The first two ex-USAAF B-17s, a B-17F and a B-17G, were obtained by the Navy for various development programs. At first, these aircraft operated under their original USAAF designations, but on July 31, 1945, they were assigned the Naval Aircraft Designation PB-1, a designation which had originally been used in 1925 for the Boeing Model 50 experimental flying boat. 32 B-17GS were used by the Navy under the designation PB-1W, the suffix W airborne early warning. A large radome for an S-band ANAPS-20 search radar was fitted underneath the fuselage, and additional internal fuel tanks were added for longer range, with the provision for additional underwing fuel tanks. Originally, the B-17 was also chosen because of its heavy defensive armament, but this was later deleted. These aircraft were painted dark blue, a standard Navy paint scheme which had been adopted in late 1944. The PB-1W eventually evolved into an early warning aircraft by virtue of its APS-20 search radar. PB-1Ws continued in USN service until 1955, gradually being phased out in favor of the Lockheed WV-2, a military version of the Lockheed 1049 Constellation commercial airliner. In July 1945, 16 B-17s were transferred to the Coast Guard via the Navy. These aircraft were initially assigned U.S. Navy Bureau numbers, but were delivered to the Coast Guard designated as PB-1GS beginning in July 1946. Coast Guard PB-1GS was stationed at a number of bases in the U.S. and Newfoundland, with 5 at Coast Guard Air Station Elizabeth City, North Carolina, 2 at CGAS San Francisco, 2 at NAS Argentia, Newfoundland, 1 at CGAS Kodiak, Alaska, and 1 in Washington state. They were used primarily for air-sea rescue, but were also used for iceberg patrol duties and for photo mapping. Air-sea rescue PB-1GS usually carried a droppable lifeboat underneath the fuselage, and the cheering turret was often replaced by a radome. The Coast Guard PB-1GS served throughout the 1950s, the last example not being withdrawn from service until October 14, 1959. Special operations. A number of B-17s were used by the CIA front companies Civil Air Transport, Air America and Intermountain Aviation for special missions. These included B-17G 44 to 85,531, registered as N809Z. These aircraft were primarily used for agent drop missions over the People's Republic of China, flying from Taiwan, with Taiwanese crews. 4 B-17s were shot down in these operations. In 1957 the surviving B-17s had been stripped of all weapons and painted black. One of these Taiwan-based B-17s was flown to Clark Air Base in the Philippines in mid-September, assigned for covert missions into Tibet. On May 28, 1962, N809Z, piloted by Connie Segrist and Douglas Price, flew Major James Smith, USAF, and Lieutenant Leonard A. Leshak, USNR, to the abandoned Soviet Arctic Ice Station NP-8, as Operation Cold Feet. Smith and Leshak parachuted from the B-17 and searched the station for several days. On June 1, Segrist and Price returned and picked up Smith and Leshak using a Fulton skyhook system installed on the B-17. N809Z was used to perform a skyhook pickup in the James Bond movie Thunderball in 1965. This aircraft, now restored to its original B-17G configuration, is on display in the Evergreen Aviation and Space Museum in McMinnville, Oregon. Operators. The B-17 was a versatile aircraft, serving in dozens of USAAF units in theaters of combat throughout World War II, and in non-bomber roles for the RAF. Its main use was in Europe, where its shorter range and smaller bomb load relative to other aircraft available did not hamper it as much as in the Pacific theater. Peak USAAF inventory was 4,574 worldwide. Survivors. Fortresses as a symbol. The B-17 Flying Fortress has become, for many reasons, an icon of American power and a symbol of its Air Force. During the 1930s, the USAAC, as articulated by then Major General Frank Maxwell Andrews and the Air Corps Tactical School, touted the bomber as a strategic weapon. General Henry H. Arnold, Chief of the Air Corps, recommended the development of bigger aircraft with better performance, and the Tactical School agreed completely. When the Model 299 was rolled out on July 28, 1935, bristling with multiple machine gun installations, Richard Williams, a reporter for the Seattle Times, coined the name Flying Fortress with his comment, "Why, it's a flying fortress." Boeing was quick to see the value of the name and had it trademarked for use. In 1943, Consolidated Aircraft commissioned a poll to see to what degree the public is familiar with the names of the Liberator and the Flying Fortress. Of 2,500 men in cities where Consolidated adverts had been run in newspapers, 73% had heard of the B-24, while 90% knew of the B-17. After the initial B-17s were delivered to the Air Corps' 2nd Bombardment Group, they were used on promotional flights emphasizing its great range and navigational precision. In January 1938, Group Commander Colonel Robert Olds flew a YB-17 from the east to west coast, setting a transcontinental record of 13 hours 27 minutes. He also broke the west to east coast record on the return trip, averaging 245 mph in 11 hours 1 minute. 6 bombers of the 2nd Bombardment Group took off from Langley Field on February 15, 1938 as part of a goodwill flight to Buenos Aires, Argentina. Covering 12,000 miles, they returned on February 27, with 7 aircraft setting off on a flight to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, 3 days later. In a well-publicized mission on May 12 of the same year, 3 B-17s intercepted, and took photographs of the Italian ocean liner SS Rex 610 miles off the Atlantic coast. Pilots who flew both preferred the B-17 over the B-24 for its greater stability and ease in formation flying. Its electrical systems were less vulnerable to damage than the B-24's hydraulics, and the B-17 flew better than the B-24 when missing an engine. During the war, the largest offensive bombing force, the 8th Air Force, had an open preference for the B-17. Lieutenant General Jimmy Doolittle wrote about his preference for equipping the 8th with B-17s, citing the logistical advantage in keeping field forces down to a minimum number of aircraft types with their individual servicing and spares. For this reason, he wanted B-17 bombers and P-51 fighters for the 8th. His views were supported by 8th Air Force statisticians, whose studies showed that Fortresses had utility and survivability much greater than that of the B-24. Making it back to base on numerous occasions despite extensive battle damage, its durability became mythical. Stories and photos of B-17's surviving battle damage were widely circulated during the war. Despite an inferior performance and smaller bomb load than the more numerous B-24, a survey of 8th Air Force crews showed a much higher rate of satisfaction in the B-17. Hollywood featured the B-17 in its period films, such as director Howard Hawks' Air Force starring John Garfield and 12 O'Clock High starring Gregory Peck. Both films were made with the full cooperation of the United States Army Air Forces and used USAAF aircraft and combat footage. In 1964, the latter film was made into a television show of the same name and ran for 3 years on ABC TV. Footage from 12 O'Clock High was also used, along with 3 restored B-17s, in the 1962 film The War Lover. The B-17 also appeared in the 1938 movie Test Pilot with Clark Gable and Spencer Tracy, with Clark Gable in command decision in 1948, in Tora! In 1970, and in Memphis Belle with Matthew Modine. Eric Stulls, Billy Zane, and Harry Connick, Jr. in 1990. The most famous B-17, the Memphis Belle, toured the U.S. with its crew to reinforce national morale. It starred in a USAAF documentary, Memphis Belle, A Story of a Flying Fortress. The B-17 has also been featured in artistic works expressing the physical and psychological stress of the combat conditions and the high casualty rates that crews suffered. Works such as The Death of the Ball Turret Gunner by Randall Jarrell and Heavy Metal's Section B-17 depict the nature of these missions. The ball turret itself has inspired works like Steven Spielberg's The Mission. Artists who served on the bomber units also created paintings and drawings depicting the combat conditions in World War II. Notable B-17s. All-American Euro B-17F tail number 124,406 survived having her tail almost cut off in a collision over Tunisia, but made it back to base in Algeria. Euro There are full stories about that claim it made it back to Britain. It flew again, but was later scrapped. Aluminum Overcaster Euro flying example. Chief Seattle Euro sponsored by the City of Seattle, it disappeared on August 14, 1942 flying a recon mission for the 19th Berg, 435th BS and the crew declared dead on December 7, 1945. Hell's Kitchen Euro B-17 F-41 to 24,392 one of only 3 early B-17Fs in 414th BS to complete more than 100 combat missions. I'll be around a Euro B-17G in the 390th Bomb Group Museum at the Pima Air and Space Museum adjacent to Davis-Monthan AFB near Tucson, AZ. Liberty Bell Euro former engine testbed restored as flying example, destroyed in a forced landing on June 13, 2011, outside of Chicago, Illinois. No fatalities. Mary Ann Euro B-17D that was part of a unmanned flight which left San Francisco on December 6, 1941 en route to Hickam Field in Hawaii, arriving during the attack on Pearl Harbor. The plane and its crew were immediately forced into action on Wake Island and in the Philippines during the outbreak of World War II. It became famous when its exploits were featured in Air Force, one of the first of the patriotic war films released in 1943. Memphis Belle Euro one of the first B-17s to complete a tour of duty of 25 missions in the 8th Air Force, now being restored for display at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force at Wright-Patterson AFB in Dayton, Ohio. Miss Every Morning Fix on a Euro B-17C previously named Pamela. Stationed in Mackay, Queensland, Australia during World War II. On June 14, 1943, crashed shortly after takeoff from Mackay whilst ferrying U.S. Forces personnel back to Port Moresby. 40 of the 41 people on board were killed. It remains the worst air disaster in Australian history. The sole survivor, Fwa Roberts, married an Australian and returned to the States. He passed away in Wichita Falls on February 4, 2004. Murder Incorporated. A Euro B-17 bombardier wearing the name of the B-17 Murder Incorporated on his jacket was used for propaganda in German newspapers. My Gal Sal, 909 a Euro flying example, Collings Foundation of Stowe, Massachusetts. Old 666 a Euro the B-17 flown by the most highly decorated crew in the Pacific Theatre, Piccadilly Lily 2 a Euro 200th from last B-17G to be built, used in the movie 12 O'Clock High. As of 2011, currently being restored to flight status, at the Plains of Fame Museum. The Pink Lady, Sally B. A Euro the last flying example in Europe. Sentimental Journey a Euro flying example, commemorative Air Force. Shoo Shoo Baby, Subaboon Magoon featured in June 1944 issue of Popular Science magazine and 1945 issue of Flying magazine. Articles talk about mobile recovery crews following October 1943 belly landing at Tannington, England. Article omitted return to service in February 1944 on 7 additional missions. Final crew called it a real crate, and successfully ditched into North Sea on March 29, 1944. A few months before the first article appeared in print. Swamp Ghost B-17E serial number 41 to 2446, a rare surviving E model recovered from a Papua New Guinea swamp, now at Pacific Aviation Museum, Pearl Harbor. The SWOOS are the only remaining B-17D, built in 1940, and the oldest surviving Flying Fortress. It is in the collection of the Smithsonian's Air and Space Museum and is being restored for final display at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force at Wright-Patterson AFB in Dayton, Ohio, simultaneously with B-17F Memphis Belle. The SWOOS was flown by Frank Kurtz, father of actress Swoosie Kurtz, who named his daughter after the bomber. Texas Raiders a flying example, commemorative Air Force. Thunderbird, Yankee Lady a flying example, Yankee Air Force. Ye Olde Papa the B-17 that Franz Stigler did not shoot down, as memorialized in the painting A Higher Call by John D. Shaw, $5,000 a 5,000th B-17 made, emblazoned with Boeing employee signatures, served with the 333rd Bomb Squadron, 96th Bomb Group in Europe. Damaged and repaired after gear-up landing, transferred to 388th Bomb Group. Returned from duty following VE Day, flown for War Bonds Tour, then stored at Kingman, Arizona. Following an unsuccessful bid for museum preservation, the aircraft was scrapped. The So What? IN-2 flown by 3-engine ZIP. Accidents and incidents. Noted B-17 pilots and crew members. Medal of Honor awards. Many B-17 crew members received military honors and 17 received the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration awarded by the United States. Brigadier General Frederick Castle awarded posthumously for remaining at controls so others could escape damaged aircraft. Second Lieutenant Robert Femoyer awarded posthumously. First Lieutenant Donald J. Gott awarded posthumously. Second Lieutenant David A. Kingsley awarded posthumously for tending to injured crew and giving up his parachute to another. First Lieutenant William A. Lawley, Jr. heroism and exceptional flying skill. Sergeant Archibald Mathis awarded posthumously. First Lieutenant Jack W. Mathis posthumously, the first airman in the European theatre to be awarded the Medal of Honor. Second Lieutenant William E. Metzger, Jr. awarded posthumously. First Lieutenant Edward Michael, First Lieutenant John C. Morgan. Captain Harl Pease, Second Lieutenant Joseph Sonoski, Sergeant Jesse Carl Lancron, Flight Engineer, exceptionally heroic action on October 5, 1944, re-entered burning plane despite severe injuries to rescue pilot, plane commander and crewman. 61,980, Sergeant Maynard H. Smith, First Lieutenant Walter E. Trumper, T. Sergeant Forrest L. Vossler, Brigadier General Kenneth Walker awarded posthumously, Major J. Zima, Jr. earned on unescorted reconnaissance mission. Other military achievements or events. Lincoln Broyhill, the 483rd Bombardment Group received a Distinguished Unit Citation, and Broyhill set 2 individual records that day: most German jets destroyed by a single gunner in one mission, and most German jets destroyed by a single gunner during the entire war. Alison C. Brooks, was awarded numerous military decorations, and was ultimately promoted to the rank of Major General and served in active duty until 1971. First Lieutenant Emil Mickey Cohen, nicknamed the Kid, flew with the 447th Bombardment Group, 709th Squadron, out of Rattlesden, England. Piloted the Barbara Jane and 2 missions on the Blue Hen Chick. Was the youngest B-17 pilot in the 8th Air Force and may have been the youngest bomber pilot in the U.S. Army Air Forces. First Lieutenant Eugene Niemand, lead pilot for Man-O-War 2 Horsepower Limited. Received the Distinguished Flying Cross, a medal with 3 oak leaf clusters, American Theatre Ribbon and Victory Ribbon. Was part of D-Day and witnessed one of the first German jets when a Me-262A1 flew through his formation over Germany. One of the youngest bomber pilots in the U.S. Army Air Forces. Emanuel J. Klett, second-generation German-American whose 91 combat missions were the most flown by any 8th Air Force pilot in World War II. Colin Kelly, pilot of the first US B-17 lost in action. Colonel Frank Kurtz, the USAAF's most decorated pilot of World War II. Commander of the 463rd Bombardment Group, 15th Air Force, Sloan Field, Foggia, Italy. Clark Field, Philippines. Attack survivor. Olympic bronze medalist in diving, 1944 Euro 1945. Father of actress Swoosie Kurtz, herself named for the still surviving B-17D mentioned above. General Curtis LeMay, became head of the Strategic Air Command and of the USAAF. Lieutenant Colonel Nancy Love and Betty Gillies, the first women to be certified to fly the B-17, in 1943. Colonel Robert K. Morgan, pilot of Memphis Belle. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Rosenthal, commanded the only surviving B-17, Rosie's Riveters, of a U.S. 8th Air Force raid by the 100th Bomb Group on Ma 1/4 NSTER on October 10, 1943. Earned 16 medals for gallantry, and led the raid on Berlin on February 3, 1945, that is likely to have ended the life of Roland Freisler, the Third Reich's infamous hanging judge. First Lieutenant Bruce Sunderland, pilot of Damn Yankee of the 384th Bomb Group, was shot down over Belgium on December 1, 1943 and evaded capture until reaching Switzerland May 5, 1944. Brigadier General Paul Tibbets, flew with the 97th Bombardment Group with both the 8th Air Force in England and the 12th Air Force in North Africa. Later pilot of the B-29 Enola Gay, dropping the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan. B-17 in the movies. Some notable movies that featured the Flying Fortress include but are not limited to, Flying Fortress, Air Force, Combat America, Memphis Belle, A Story of a Flying Fortress, 12 O'Clock High, The War Lover, The Thousand Plane Raid, Torah. Heavy Metal, Memphis Belle and Fortress. Civilian Achievements or Events, Martin Caidin, author of Cyborg, the story that formed the basis of the $6 Million Man, wrote the saga of the last transatlantic formation flight of B-17s ever made, Everything But the Flak. Clark Gable, Academy Award-winning film actor, 5 missions as waist gunner with several groups from May to September 1943, including the B-17 8-ball of the 359th Bomb Squadron. Ive Homer. Philadelphia radio host, served as 15th Air Force B-17 co-pilot during WW2. Tom Landry, American football player and coach, flew 30 missions over Europe in 1944 Euro 45 as a B-17 pilot with the 493rd Bomb Group, surviving a crash landing in Belgium. Norman Lear, radio operator, with the 463rd Bombardment Group, 15th Air Force, Sloan Field, Foggia, Italy. Television producer of American sitcoms Sanford and Son, Maude and All in the Family, among others. Gene Roddenberry, creator of Star Trek. Flew B-17s for the 394th Bomb Squadron, 5th Bomb Group, in the Pacific Theater. Robert Rosenthal, assistant to the U.S. prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials, where he interrogated Hermann Gar Paragraph Ring, pilot with the 100th Bomb Group. Brigadier General Robert Lee Scott, Jr., best known for his autobiography God Is My Co-Pilot, about his exploits in World War II with the Flying Tigers and the United States Army Air Forces in China and Burma. James Stewart, Academy Award-winning film actor, instructed in B-17s before flying 20 combat missions in B-24s with the 8th Air Force, England. Retired from Air Force Reserve as a brigadier general. Burt Stiles, 91st Bomb Group co-pilot from March to October 1944, short story author, killed in action flying a P-51 on a second tour. Bruce Sunderland, 384th Bomb Group pilot of B-17F Damn Yankee, avoided capture after being shot down over Jubek, Belgium, December 1, 1943 to become a lawyer, businessman and governor of Rhode Island, 1991 Euro 95. Smokey Yunick, award-winning motorsports car designer and premier NASCAR crew chief, flew 50 missions as a B-17 pilot with the 97th Bombardment Group of the 15th Air Force, out of Amendola Airfield, Foggia, Italy. Specifications. Data from the Encyclopedia of World Aircraft, General Characteristics, Crew, 10 Pilot, Co-Pilot, Navigator, Bombardier Nose Gunner, Flight Engineer Top Turret Gunner, Radio Operator, Waist Gunners, Ball Turret Gunner, Tail Gunner, Length, 74 feet 4 inches, wingspan, 103 feet 9 in, height, 19 feet 1 in, wing area, 1,420 square feet, airfoil, NACA0018/NACA0010, aspect ratio, 7.57, empty weight, 36,135 pounds, loaded weight, 54,000 pounds, max takeoff weight, 65,500 pounds, power plant, 4A, Wright R1820-97 Cyclone turbo supercharged radial engines, 1,200 horsepower each, performance, maximum speed, 287 miles per hour, cruise speed, 182 miles per hour, range, 2,000 miles with 2,700 kilograms bomb load, service ceiling, 35,600 feet, rate of climb, 900 feet per minute, wing loading, 38.0 pounds per square foot, power mass, 0.089 horsepower per pound, armament, guns, 13A. .50 and M2 Browning machine guns in 8 positions, bombs, short-range missions, 8,000 pounds, long-range missions, 4,500 pounds, overload, 17,600 pounds. See also: Air warfare of World War II, Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress variants, B-17 Flying Fortress units of the United States Army Air Forces, accidents and incidents involving the B-17 Flying Fortress, related development, Boeing XB-15, Boeing XB-38 Flying Fortress, Boeing YB-40 Flying Fortress, Boeing C-108 Flying Fortress, aircraft of comparable role, configuration and era, Avro Lancaster, Consolidated B-24 Liberator, Focke-Wulf FW-200, Handley Page Halifax, Heinkel He-177, Junkers Ju-290, Pitlyakov P-8, Piggio Pages 108B, Short Sterling. Related lists, List of bomber aircraft, List of aircraft of World War II, List of military aircraft of the United States, References, Notes. Citations. Bibliography. Further reading. Wagner, Ray, American Combat Planes of the 20th Century, Reno, Nevada, 2004, Jack Bacon and Company, ISBN 0-930083-17-2. External links, 1940, T001-20 EC1 Handbook of Operation and Flight Instructions for the Model B-17 Sea Bombardment Airplane, 1943, AN01-20 EF1 Pilots Flight Operating Instructions for Army Models B-17F and G, British Model Fortress 2, World War II 8th Air Force website.